bronchiectasis, which is also a big issue for PCD patients. And so he will talk on bronchiectasis here, which is a talk that he gave with our field group in Milton-Keynes, possibly roughly the same.
I've changed it a little bit.
Very good. It was already brilliant in July in Milton-Keynes. So we're very much looking forward to James speaking and then taking questions at the end of it. Yeah?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you. It's really exciting to meet so many parents and children with PCD and talk about all things bronchiectasis and PCD. I look after about 600 patients with bronchiectasis in the east of Scotland, and we have a large group of those patients that have PCD, but I look after primarily adults, so a lot of what I'm going to say comes from more of an adult perspective, but has also a lot of relevance to children. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what bronchiectasis is. So many patients with PCD over their lives will develop bronchiectasis. It's a permanent damage of the lungs that impairs the clearance of mucus from the airways. So you can see here on the picture, the normal airway has these little tubes that come down from the windpipe all the way down to the periphery. They're nice narrow tubes that allow both the air to come in for gas exchange, but also allow the mucus to come out very easily. And then when you develop bronchiectasis, and this is a sort of cartoon representation of bronchiectasis, you get damage to the wall of the lung, and that means that the lungs dilate, and so the mucus is much harder to clear. And even if you didn't start with problems with the cilia then find it much more difficult to clear those damaged tubes. And so you develop symptoms like coughing, bringing up sputum, feeling short of breath because the gas doesn't get down those damaged tubes as well as it would down a normal tube. So bronchiectasis is widening, dilation of the bronchi, and the lungs become obstructed with mucus. That damage leads to infections because if you can't clear the mucus out of the airways, it's more likely to get infected. A good analogy I use with my patients is that if you have your tea, put your plates in the sink, and then don't wash them up and leave them in the sink for 2 days, the water will be all horrible and full of gunk. And that's kind of what happens in the airways in people with bronchiectasis. If the mucus that's there can't clear, it's more likely to become infected. And so those areas of lung become damaged and less functional, and that's why patients have symptoms like breathlessness. And another way of thinking about what happens in bronchiectasis is this idea of the vicious cycle, because everybody who has bronchiectasis has different aspects of these 4 things. You may have problems with clearance of mucus at the bottom because your cilia don't work, so they don't clear the mucus as well. That can lead to lung damage, things like breathlessness and coughing, lung infections, going with chest infections needing to be treated with antibiotics, and the lungs become inflamed, and it's the inflammation that causes things like the thickness of the mucus that many patients complain of. And so when we try and treat bronchiectasis or PCD, one of the ways we can think about it is trying to give treatments that target each of these 4 things. So you can help to clear mucus by doing physio, you can help to treat lung damage, for example, through inhalers that improve the gas exchange in the airways. You can treat infection with antibiotics, and we can treat inflammation with anti-inflammatory medicines. Following on from the last talk, I'm going to introduce you to a bit of bronchiectasis research, just focusing initially on infection, and then I'll talk a bit about anti-inflammatory treatment later on. The last talk was a nice introduction to this concept of the microbiome, the fact that we all have bugs that live in our bodies. And what happens in bronchiectasis is that that normal system doesn't work quite well. And so patients with bronchiectasis and PCD, eventually the lungs become colonized with bugs. Now, you're all covered in bugs. All of us have bacteria, but in bronchiectasis and PCD, often even when people are well, they cough up and produce a sputum sample, we send it to the lab, they may grow a bacteria in that we wouldn't see in healthy people. And about 2/3 of people with established bronchiectasis will have a bug in the phlegm. You don't always have to treat it with antibiotics because it might just be living there quite harmlessly in the lungs. And the most common ones are there, things like Haemophilus, which is one that lives at the back of the throats of healthy people, Pseudomonas, which is one that lives in your gut, and we'll come back in a few minutes to the links between your gut and your lungs, and other ones like Streptococcus, which again lives at the back of the throat. So you've already heard, are all bugs bad? No, we have good bacteria, we have bad bacteria. And one of the things that we think happens in bronchiectasis is you gradually get a change from the normal good bacteria that should live in your lungs to the more harmful bacteria. Which bits of your body have the most bacteria? I'm going to try and make you play along with me. Which bits of your body have the most bacteria?
Stomach.
Yep, so stomach and your whole gut, yeah? That's number one. Number two? Yeah, so your skin is number two. You're very good, you could be biologists. Number three? Any idea? It's your mouth. Your mouth has loads of bacteria. That's why you have to brush your teeth every day. Otherwise the bacteria grows up. So humans are amazing because we have 10 times more bacteria than we do human cells. So if our bodies were a democracy, the bacteria would get to make the decisions because there's more of them than us. And so the last talk introduced the idea that we think of this now as an organ. And there are just so many bacteria that it's hard to imagine that they don't all interact with each other. So what's going on in your gut probably affects what's going on in your lungs. And a lot of those bugs that we find in bronchiectasis are actually bugs we know start off in the gut. So here's an example of some of the research that we do. So we have a technology that allows us to take sputum samples or samples from the lung and look at all of the bacteria that live there. Rather than putting on a plate and trying to grow a bacteria, you can sequence genetically all of the bacteria that are present in the lung. And what you find is that the average person has 400 or 500 different types of bacteria in a healthy lung. It's extraordinary. So the lungs are not sterile, they're absolutely full of bacteria. And what happens in people with very bad bronchiectasis is that you start to see a loss of the bacteria. So just to orientate you to this, each color here is another type of bacteria, loads of bacteria. And the one you can see there that's all completely purple, they've lost all the normal bacteria, they've just got this one bad bug that's taken over. And that's a patient that's not very well. Whereas the patients on the right-hand side, who've got lots of different coloured bands all the way down, they're quite well. Because their normal lung flora, the normal bacteria that are meant to live there, are quite happily interacting with each other. And so you start to wonder, what is it that happens that changes somebody from the healthy microbiome to the unhealthy microbiome? Any thoughts? Apart from the severity of the lung disease? Any ideas? So one thing is antibiotic exposure. So we probably over our lifetimes get a lot of antibiotics and that kills off some of our good bacteria. The other thing is our environment. So being exposed to good bacteria is probably a really good thing. One of the strongest risk factors for developing lung disease we've discovered over the last 10 years is where you live and the air you breathe. So this is a study that looked at the frequency of different lung diseases, different areas like asthma, rhinitis and things, just depending on whether you lived next to a farm or not. And you can see from the graphs, you're much less likely to develop lung problems like asthma and wheeze if you live next to a farm. Why would that be? Why would you have less if you live next to a farm? Yeah, so this is an electron micrograph of the air in a barn, in a farm. And you've got bacteria, and you've got fungi, you've got all these things that your body kind of wants to replenish its normal microbiome. So Amelia's at the back there with 2 children just now. I'm going to give her some parenting advice, which is, this is how to keep kids healthy, apparently. But genuinely, the interaction with our environment is really important. We increasingly live in a kind of sterile urban environment where we don't get exposed to bacteria. We take a lot of antibiotics, and there is some evidence that actually we need to also replenish that normal bacterial flora. So what happens with the bacteria in your lungs, whether you've got bronchiectasis or not, but it's particularly important for people with bronchiectasis, is essentially a feature of what goes in and what comes out. So things that mean more bacteria goes in, your environment. So if you're in an environment that's got nice, good, clean air, you also have lots of bacteria and fungi in the environment. That seems to be very healthy for you. Replenishes the good things that are meant to be in there. The diet makes a difference because a lot of these bad bacteria come from nasty bacteria in the gut. People who eat a healthy diet and maintain a healthy weight have better outcomes if they've got bronchiectasis than people that don't, and that's probably because less of the bad bacteria go up through what we call reflux, so stuff refluxing from the gut into the lungs. Dental health is really important. You've got 10 billion bacteria in your mouth. Some of those are the ones that we find in the lungs that cause infections. And also nasal disease, which is particularly important for people with PCD. And we're constantly hammering to the doctors that if you don't treat the nasal disease, the lungs won't get better because what's in the nose goes down into the lungs and affects the lungs. And what comes out is really important. Of course, getting your cilia to work is very important. Doing your physio gets the bad bacteria out, maintaining a healthy weight, being able to have an effective cough, and having an immune system that works well. And one of our interests in Dundee is also looking at the effects of air pollution, which seems to have an effect on preventing bacteria from coming out of the lungs. So in some cases, antibiotics are going to be really good for people with bronchiectasis, and in some cases, they might not help with the microbiome. And so how do you know whether I should be giving certain types of people antibiotics? The answer is we have to do clinical trials. We have to take groups of people with lung disease and see whether they do benefit from getting antibiotics. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about clinical trials. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. We need clinical trials because historically, doctors have not been very good at telling people what to do just based on their own opinions. Great sort of cartoons like the doctor recommends cigarettes and things like that. So we need evidence to tell you what's the best thing to do for your patients, or what's the best thing to do for your children, or what's the best thing for you. And so we need to do clinical trials. Can anyone think when the first ever clinical trial was conducted? Can you guess? Any idea?
Scurvy one.
1920s. Any advance on the 1920s?
The scurvy one.
The scurvy one, yes! Lots of people have heard of the scurvy one. The scurvy one is probably the world's first randomized clinical trial. I'm going to show you in a minute. I found one that's slightly older, which is in the Bible. So I'm convinced this is the first ever recorded randomized clinical trial. It's a passage in the Bible where somebody says that their servants are very lethargic and not doing things very well. So they say, why don't you try a 10-day experiment where you give them, instead of the rich, horrible fatty foods that the royal court eats, give them vegetables for 10 days. And they report in this passage that the servants felt much better after 10 days. So that's a clinical trial. Take a group of people that have a problem, do an intervention, see what the outcome is. If it works, the treatment probably works. But the most famous clinical trial, probably the first proper controlled clinical trial, was James Linn's scurvy experiment. And this was amazing, really, at the time. Nobody knew what caused scurvy, which is a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. Sailors would go away on ships for long periods. They wouldn't have any fruit on board, so they'd develop this disease called scurvy. And so he took 12 sailors who had this condition and randomized them to either get cider, vitriol, which is some horrible concoction that doesn't exist anymore, vinegar, seawater, orange and lemon, or paste made from spices. And the only people that got better were the ones that got orange and lemon. So he concluded that scurvy could be treated with oranges and lemon. Great experiment, really, really good. And so we had the world's first clinical trial. And now what we do is essentially different versions of what James Linn did, trying to test things like antibiotics and new therapies for bronchiectasis. And one of the things we're very interested in, trying to find different ways to give people antibiotics. Many of you will have been given a course of antibiotics in the past. This is another question. So I give you a tablet with 250 milligrams of amoxicillin. How much of that would end up in your lungs? Any idea? Sorry? C? 0.1%? Great guess. Yeah, it's about 1,000th. It's absolutely right. So you think you take a tablet, it would go to where the infection is. It doesn't. It goes to your gut, it goes to the rest of your body, because it doesn't somehow know to go to the lungs where the infection is. And so you have to take lots and lots of antibiotic. and cause things like problems with the gut, just to get enough into your lungs. And so here, I start to think about, isn't there a better way of doing this? So I think philosophy. Who's the world's greatest philosopher in history? Aristotle? No? Anyone else? I think it's Forrest Gump. I think Forrest Gump is the world's greatest philosopher, because he tells you that life is like a box of chocolates, and I think antibiotic treatment is like a box of chocolates. And what we kind of do with antibiotic treatment is eat one chocolate and then throw the rest away. So we give enormous doses of antibiotics, and we only use tiny amounts of it. So there are better ways of using antibiotics. We now have antibiotics that can be concentrated at the site of infection, don't go as much to the gut, and we have inhaled antibiotics that only go to the lungs. And here's an example of a randomized controlled trial of an antibiotic. These are called macrolides, so they're antibiotics that concentrate inside your cells, and the majority of the drug goes to where the infection is. And so we give these at a very low dose over the course of a year to people with bronchiectasis to cut their number of infections and make them feel better. And what you can see from the lines, the blue one is the patients that got the drug, the red one is the patients that didn't get the drug. The line at the top is higher because fewer of the patients got chest infections during the study. So patients felt much better, had much less infections when they got this treatment. This is a treatment that can be really transformative for people with bronchiectasis. And it's a relatively large study with over 350 patients. The other way of doing this is to give people a nebulizer that puts antibiotics directly into the lungs. And that's a little bit more tricky in terms of people have to sit on a nebulizer for a long period of time, but it does mean, as you can see from the graph here with the purple, large amounts of antibiotic get into the lungs when you treat them that way, and hardly any of it gets into the blood or into the gut. But we've had some difficulties with trials of these drugs. So I've shown you those two curves before. If the curves are apart, it means the drug's working. If the curves are together, it means the drugs aren't working. Two trials that I conducted over the last few years. The one on the left says the antibiotics work really well, patients feel much better. The one on the right is another group of patients, different group of patients, and they didn't feel better. Which is why I go back to this thing about the microbiome. Why are there some types of people that respond to an antibiotic and some that don't? So you have to design a trial in a way that's going to make people feel better and is going to give the drug to the right people. So maybe I designed that trial wrong. So I'll give you an example of a trial that's been designed wrong, and you can tell me whether I designed my trial wrong. So a question for you: does a parachute prevent death or major injury when jumping out of a plane? This isn't a difficult question. But you know, in medicine, we have to do a trial. Yeah, we have to do a trial for everything. So a randomized controlled trial. This is a trial somebody did, and the outcome of the trial is death or major injury. Yeah. So here's the trial. 92 people were invited to do the study. 64 very sensible people declined to do the study. 5 were deemed unsuitable by the investigator. I wonder if that's because they were related to the investigators. But 23 people agreed and were randomized to either jumping out of a plane without parachute or jumping out of a plane with a parachute. Some people are looking very worried in the audience. Don't worry, this has a happy ending. Okay, and so 12 people, here we are. 12 people got the intervention, 11 got the control being jumping out of a parachute without a plane. Jumping out of a parachute without a plane. That's a different trial, I'll tell you about that another time. And at the end of the study, 9 and 11 people actually completed the jump. And nobody died, and nobody got injured. How did that happen? Who's the clever people in the audience? Sorry? Into water? The plane never took off. Look! So this is bad trial design. So if I test something, and I know that the outcome's never going to happen, I can come to a conclusion that says, you don't need a parachute to jump out of a plane. So that's not right, is it? Looks fun, but it's not correct. So if I treat people with big doses of antibiotics who have healthy-looking lungs like this, what's going to happen? I'm not going to make them better because there wasn't a problem in the first place. Just like you don't need a parachute to jump from that chair down. But if I treat the people who've got this, the patients will get better because they've got a problem with bacteria in the lungs. And so this is a subsequent study where we looked at people that had low and high levels of bacteria in the lungs, and this is how much they felt better, and the ones who felt better are the ones that had the high bacteria in the lungs. So we can develop tests now that can say, you need antibiotics. And better yet, a test that says, you don't need antibiotics. You're not going to feel better if I give you a big nebulizer with an antibiotic in it. And how do we do that? Well, the Sputum Culture, there's taking samples and sending them to the lab. But we're starting trials next year of a device that looks like this, which is you plug it into a USB port on a computer, put a DNA from a sputum sample onto it, and it tells you within 6 hours what bugs are there, down to very detailed levels, and therefore whether you're likely to be the sort of person that will benefit from an antibiotic. So we're trying to move from the idea of just give everybody antibiotics regardless of who they are or what they need, to using tests to say you really do need an antibiotic. I've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to do a tiny little bit on inflammation, mostly because I want to share with you my favourite bronchiectasis fact. Do you know why sputum is green? This is really cool biology. So sputum, I spend most of my days talking about sputum. I'm kind of a sputumologist. So sputum is green, like that, when there's infection there. And it turns green because your body only has a single green protein. If you think about it, there's no part of your body that's green, apart from when your phlegm turns green. And it's in your white blood cells. So you have a white blood cell that's got a green bit inside it, and when white blood cells accumulate, sputum turns green. It's your body's natural infection detection system. Isn't that cool? I love that the body kind of has these amazing, amazing things. And these white blood cells are the things that help you to fight infection. I've got a little video of one of them, if I can get it to play. I can. This is one of your amazing little white blood cells. And the thing on the end of the pipette there is a bit of food that it wants to eat. So it gets rid of bacteria by trying to eat the little bits of bacteria. And we're teasing it here because it really wants to eat. It's very hungry. And desperately trying to eat this thing. Come on, I want to eat. Aren't they amazing? And then he's getting really annoyed now. It's like us waiting for the coffee break, and so we eventually have to feed it, otherwise it will get very upset. And so that system is how your body gets rid of infections from the lungs. And that system stops working in people with bronchiectasis. Instead of chasing after the bacteria and eating them, they kind of panic. And we've shown that they do this thing that I've got here on the bottom, which is called releasing net, which is kind of panicking and releasing all of the toxins from the cells without being able to eat the bacteria. And so this is kind of what happens. You see the blue is healthy cells, and the red is when they've panicked and exploded. And you'll see over the course of a couple of hours here, all of the cells kind of panic and release all of this damaging stuff. And that's what you cough up if you've got bronchiectasis. You cough up your green white blood cells that have panicked and haven't been able to clear the infections. And so a trial that we're really excited about that just finished last month is a study where we're using an inhibitor of an enzyme that is involved in the development of these white blood cells, essentially switches off their panic response, stops them from doing that, and makes them have to do the eating that I showed you on the video. Restores the normal function of your white blood cells to potentially treat infections without needing antibiotics. It would be so much better if we can make the body's own natural defenses kill the bugs, rather than always having to give antibiotics for bronchiectasis. So I think I will finish there, because in the interest of time, I want to thank lots of very clever people who do research in Dundee. So Amelia, who's in the back, and myself have a wonderful team of researchers who are all working to do new trials, new studies, understand how bronchiectasis works, understand how cilia function works, and we're very grateful both to the funders, including our friends in the PCD Scotland support group, for helping us to understand these diseases and to do really fun research. So I'll finish there. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you.